On June 12, 2026, Canada's Prime Minister stood in front of Parliament and said 7 words that changed North American geopolitics forever. We will not accept unilateral claims to Greenland. Now look, most people scrolled past that headline. Another diplomatic squabble, right? Another boring press conference about Arctic sovereignty that puts you to sleep faster than an economics textbook. Wrong. What Canada just did wasn't a warning to Denmark. It wasn't even really about Greenland. It was a checkmate move against the United States. And by the time Washington realizes what's happening, the trap will already be shut, because here's what nobody's telling you. In the last 18 months, while you were watching election drama and scrolling through tech announcements, the entire global power structure just shifted north, and the United States, the world's only remaining superpower, just got locked out of the most important strategic region of the 21st century by an ally, by Canada, with a smile and a treaty signature. And by the end of this video, you're going to see exactly how they did it. While the mainstream media is obsessing over tech earnings, celebrity scandals, and whatever controversy is trending this week, the real power shift is happening in the Arctic. And it's not just ice and polar bears anymore. Here's what they're not telling you. Greenland sits on approximately 38.5 million tons of rare earth elements. That's more than the entire rest of the world's proven reserves combined. We're talking about the minerals that power every smartphone, every EV battery, every missile defense system, every wind turbine, every advanced weapons platform on the planet. For the last 18 months, the US has been quietly negotiating with Denmark to establish what they're calling strategic mineral partnerships. That's Washington speak. Translation: America wants exclusive access. They want first dibs. They want to break China's stranglehold on rare earths by controlling Greenland's deposits. And they were this close to getting it. But Canada just said, not so fast. Let's be real for a second. This isn't about environmental protection or indigenous rights, though those are absolutely part of the conversation and they matter. This is about control. This is about who gets to write the rules for the next 100 years of global commerce. And Canada just played a card that Washington never saw coming. Because while American diplomats were busy in Copenhagen, shaking hands and drafting resource agreements, Canada was building a coalition, a legal framework, a trap. First, you need to understand the map, and I mean really understand it, not the flat projection you see in classrooms. The real map, the one that shows what the world actually looks like from the top. Greenland isn't just big, it's a 836,000 square mile fortress sitting directly between North America and Europe. Every single northern shipping route, every transatlantic flight path, every undersea data cable in the Arctic, they all pass through Greenland's sphere of influence. Think about it. If you're shipping containers from Shanghai to Rotterdam, you have 2 options. You can go south through the Suez Canal, adding weeks to your journey and paying expensive canal fees. Or you can go through the Panama Canal on the other side, which is even longer from Asia. Both routes, completely controlled or heavily influenced by US military presence and diplomatic relationships. But there's a third route now, and it just became viable. For the last century, none of this mattered. The ice made the region essentially impassable for most of the year, a frozen wasteland that showed up on maps but didn't factor into global strategy beyond military early warning systems. But climate change just unlocked the Arctic, and with it, a completely new game board. The Northwest Passage, the sea route through the Canadian Arctic, shaves 4,000 nautical miles off the journey from Asia to Europe. That's not a small optimization. That's billions in saved shipping costs. That's weeks off delivery times. That's a complete restructuring of global logistics. And Canada controls it. Not the United States, Canada. Now here's where it gets sticky. Canada and Denmark have overlapping territorial claims in the Arctic, For years, they've been playing nice. There's literally a disputed island called Hans Island, where Canadian and Danish military would take turns visiting and leaving bottles of whiskey for each other. It became this joke, this symbol of peaceful Arctic cooperation. But the second the US started serious talks with Denmark about Greenland, something changed. Canada invoked the 2024 Ottawa Declaration. And if you haven't heard of this treaty, don't feel bad. It was deliberately kept low profile, signed during a routine Arctic cooperation summit that barely made international news. This agreement basically says that any unilateral resource agreements in disputed Arctic zones require pan-Arctic consensus, which means Canada gets a veto, Russia gets a veto, Norway gets a veto, Iceland gets a veto, everyone except the United States. Because here's the thing, by every legal definition in international maritime law, the United States is not an Arctic nation. Alaska gives them Arctic coastline, sure, but the way these treaties are written, the way boundaries are defined, Washington doesn't have the same stakeholder status as countries whose primary northern borders touch the Arctic Ocean. The US just got boxed out of the most important resource negotiation of the decade by an ally, using international law and environmental frameworks that America itself helped create. You can't make this up, but that's not even the craziest part, because while this was happening publicly, there was a whole other negotiation happening behind closed doors. In March 2025, something unusual happened. Canada's foreign minister made a quiet trip to Copenhagen. No press conference, no photo ops. It was listed on her schedule as bilateral trade discussions. 14 months later, we now know what was really happening. Canada and Denmark were drafting a joint Arctic development framework, a completely separate agreement that had nothing to do with the US negotiations. And here's the genius of it. They didn't violate any existing treaties. They didn't break any agreements. They just created a new framework that established Canada and Denmark as co-primary stakeholders in Greenland's resource development. The agreement includes provisions for joint environmental oversight, shared infrastructure development, and, most importantly, a clause that requires any third-party mineral extraction agreements to be approved by both Ottawa and Copenhagen. The United States can still negotiate with Denmark, but now every single agreement has to go through Canada too. And Canada just made it very clear that they're not interested in giving Washington exclusive access, because Canada has its own problems with rare earth dependence, its own supply chain vulnerabilities, its own national security concerns about being economically dependent on China. Why would they let America solve its rare earth problem while leaving Canada in the same vulnerable position? They wouldn't, and they didn't. Let's talk about why this actually matters to you. Why this isn't just some abstract geopolitical chess game. Right now, as I'm recording this, China controls about 60% of the world's rare earth production and 85% of the refining capacity. The US has been trying to break that monopoly for a decade. Multiple administrations, billions in funding, domestic mining projects that can't compete on cost. Greenland was supposed to be the answer, the breakthrough, the way to finally achieve rare earth independence without having to rely on Beijing. Without rare earths, the Pentagon can't build F-35s. The guidance systems require specific rare earth elements that you can't substitute. Tesla can't build batteries at scale. Apple can't build iPhones. Wind turbines can't generate power efficiently. This isn't hyperbole. This is supply chain reality. Every single piece of modern technology depends on these 17 elements. And right now, if China decided to cut off exports tomorrow, the entire Western economy would grind to a halt within months. The Department of Defense has war-gamed this scenario multiple times. They call it the rare earth embargo scenario, and every simulation ends the same way. the US loses, not because of military inferiority, because of supply chains. Greenland has deposits of neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, terbium, all the critical elements that modern militaries need, in quantities that could supply the entire Western world for centuries. And Canada just ensured that access to these deposits goes through Ottawa first. When Canada's Prime Minister made that statement on June 12th, she didn't just invoke a treaty. She revealed that Canada and Denmark had already signed preliminary agreements for joint mining operations, joint refining facilities, joint export controls. The press release used a lot of diplomatic language about sustainable development and indigenous consultation. But buried in paragraph 7 was the real message. All resource extraction agreements will prioritize Arctic nations' strategic interests and require consensus approval from framework signatories. Guess who's not a framework signatory? The United States. Now, the US still has Pituffik Space Base in Greenland. That's the former Thule Air Base. That's not going anywhere. It's too strategically important for missile detection and satellite operations. Denmark isn't going to kick out American military presence. But access to minerals, access to new ports, access to shipping route authority, Canada just made sure those all go through Ottawa first. And here's where it gets even more complex. Because this isn't just about rare earths, it's about what comes next. The US military has been planning Arctic expansion for years. New bases, new ports, enhanced submarine capabilities. The Arctic is becoming a major military theater, and the Pentagon knows it. Russia's been building up its Arctic forces for over a decade. Nuclear icebreakers, new air bases, submarine facilities. They've been ahead of this curve while America was focused on the Middle East and the Pacific. Now the US is trying to catch up. But here's the problem. Every new military installation in the Arctic region requires cooperation from Arctic nations. And those nations are now coordinated through frameworks that give them collective bargaining power. Canada just became the gatekeeper, not just for resources, for military positioning, for infrastructure development, for everything. Let me paint you a picture of what this means in practice. Let's say the US wants to build a new deep-water port in Greenland for Arctic operations. Previously, that was a bilateral negotiation with Denmark. Now it requires Canadian approval too, and Norwegian approval, and potentially Russian non-objection depending on the location. Every single strategic move the US wants to make in the Arctic just got exponentially more complicated, and expensive, and slow. Believe it or not, this is already affecting markets. If you've been watching rare earth commodity prices, you've seen the volatility. Neodymium oxide jumped 14% in the 2 weeks after Canada's announcement. Praseodymium hit a 3-year high. Because traders understand what this means, the timeline for American rare earth independence just got pushed back, maybe by years, maybe by decades. And that means continued dependence on Chinese supply chains, which means leverage, which means every trade negotiation, every diplomatic dispute, every geopolitical tension with Beijing comes with an implicit threat. The economic implications cascade outward from there. If the US can't secure independent rare earth access, then every clean energy initiative is vulnerable. The entire electric vehicle transition depends on battery production. Battery production depends on rare earths. Climate goals, supply chain dependent. Defense modernization, supply chain dependent. Tech sector growth, supply chain dependent. Canada just put a toll booth on America's path to strategic independence. And here's what makes this so brilliant from Canada's perspective. They didn't have to do anything aggressive. They didn't threaten. They didn't posture. They just read the map better than Washington did. For 70 years, the United States has been the global superpower because it controlled the choke points. The Strait of Hormuz. U.S. Navy presence ensures oil flows freely. the Panama Canal, U.S. sphere of influence, the Suez Canal, American diplomatic and military relationships keep it open, global trade routes, protected by U.S.-backed security architecture. This has been the foundation of American power since World War II, not just military strength, geographic positioning, but there's one route America never controlled because it didn't exist yet, the Arctic routes. And now that they exist, now that climate change has made them viable, someone else got there first. By 2030, analysts estimate that 25% of global shipping could shift to Arctic routes. That's not a prediction anymore. That's math based on ice melt patterns and freight cost analysis. 25% of global trade, flowing through waters that the United States does not control. Canada just became the gatekeeper to the future of global logistics, and they used America's own playbook to do it. When the U.S. wanted to control Middle Eastern oil, it built bases and alliances. When it wanted to dominate tech, it controlled semiconductor supply chains. When it wanted to maintain financial hegemony, it made the dollar the world's reserve currency. Canada just did the same thing with rare earths and shipping lanes. Except they did it with a smile, a treaty, and perfect legal cover. The Pentagon can't invade an ally. Can you imagine the headlines? U.S. invades Canada over Greenland access. That's not happening. Wall Street can't sanction Ottawa without destroying NAFTA and crippling the North American economy. And the White House can't exactly tweet its way out of a multilateral Arctic framework. The United States just learned what it feels like to be on the other side of strategic encirclement. And here's the part that should really worry Washington. This isn't just about Canada. Because once Canada proved that you can outmaneuver the US using international frameworks and coalition building, other countries are paying attention. What's to stop other American allies from using similar tactics? What's to stop regional coalitions from forming around resources or strategic positions that the U.S. currently takes for granted? The playbook just got published, and everyone's reading it. So what happens next? That's the real question. Watch the rare earth market over the next 6 months. If prices continue climbing, that's the market pricing in extended American dependence on Chinese supply chains. Watch Arctic development announcements. If you start seeing joint Canadian-Danish infrastructure projects breaking ground, that's the framework moving from paper to reality. And watch what happens when the next U.S. administration tries to renegotiate. Because they will try. This is too important to let sit. But here's the thing about coalition frameworks. They're much harder to break than bilateral agreements. Canada isn't acting alone anymore. They're acting as part of an Arctic consensus, and that consensus has legal weight, international recognition, environmental credibility. Breaking it would require the U.S. to essentially abandon decades of its own diplomatic positioning on international cooperation and environmental protection. It would require admitting that all those high-minded principles about multilateralism only apply when America benefits from them. Good luck selling that to the international community. Good luck maintaining moral authority on other issues after that. Canada didn't fire a shot. They didn't even raise their voice. They just read the map better than Washington did. They saw the ice melting and understood what it meant before anyone else positioned themselves to capitalize on it. And now Greenland, this massive island that most people couldn't find on a map 2 years ago, sits at the center of 21st century geopolitics. Control Greenland's resources and shipping access, and you control a massive piece of the global economy. The United States always assumed that when the Arctic opened up, they'd have a seat at the table, a primary seat, the kind of influence that a superpower expects to have. Instead, they're on the outside looking in, watching Canada and Denmark draft the rules, watching Russia expand its Arctic infrastructure unopposed, watching China invest in Arctic research and positioning itself as a near-Arctic state with interests in the region. The Arctic isn't melting, it's opening, and the United States just realized it's been locked out of the room where the future is being decided. The question isn't whether this matters, it does. The question is what America does about it. And right now, they don't have a lot of good options. If you want to track how this plays out in real time, keep your eye on Denmark's next election cycle. Because whoever controls Copenhagen might just control the 21st century. Watch for Canadian infrastructure announcements in the Arctic. Watch for rare earth joint ventures being announced between Ottawa and Copenhagen. And watch the US response. Because that's going to tell you everything you need to know about whether American foreign policy has adapted to this new reality or whether they're still playing by the old rules. The superpower just got trapped. Not by an enemy, by the map itself, by geography and treaties and strategic positioning that happened while everyone was looking somewhere else. Welcome to the New World Order. It runs through the Arctic, and the United States doesn't control it.